how to make, or how I made, mid-century, minimalist-inspired living room built-ins. Let's get into it. To kick things off, I started by ripping a piece of 3/4 inch walnut veneered plycore plywood down to 4-foot halves, i.e. the length dimension of what would become the 2 bench bookshelves. Then, using the table saw, cut 4 16-inch wide planks for the top and bottoms of the bench shelves, as well as 2 additional 16-inch wide planks that I'd ripped down into the outside and center uprights. For a cleaner connection and less edge banding later, I decided to bevel the edges of the top corners of each bench at 45 degrees. With the basic framework pieces roughed out, I set about cutting the recesses for the center support on the inside face of both the upper and lower bench shelf panels. First, by finding and marking the center of each panel. Then, with a simple router jig, cutting the recess 1/4 inch deep and 1 inch shorter than the width of the center support panel. To hide any unsightliness at the edge of the recess, I cut a mirroring 1-inch recess at the front corners of the center support upright so that they would slide nicely into place. With all the major cuts done for the outer framework of the bench shelves, I gave the interior faces a sand down before beginning to assemble all the pieces. To connect the bottom panels to the outer uprights, I opted for the quick, unartistic, but tried and true pocket hole system. With those anchored into place, I could set about gluing the top panel. Fret not, I'm coming back to pin those beveled corners later. Once both frames were done, I needed to anchor the beveled wall support to the bottom before installing the interior shelves/drawers. I opted for a mirrored beveled system, where one bevel would be anchored to the bottom of the built-ins and it's matched to the wall at the height level to the 4-inch feet. After cutting out the pieces, I screwed them into place, making sure the screws' heads were flush with the veneer. With those in place, I could turn to the shelves. I ripped them down to size and again used pocket holes to anchor them in place. I used a few equally cut scraps to make sure that they were level before screwing in the pocket holes. With the upper shelves, I started by cutting the angled face out of the shelf panels. I chose to stack the cut pieces and cut all at once to ensure as close to an exact pair as possible. Then, you guessed it, I opted for pocket holes to anchor the shelves to the uprights. I think because this project was so big and my first real attempt at built-ins, I was a little afraid to waste lumber by screwing up a joint that could have been more simple and equally effective. I'll try and be a little more courageous next time. With the upper shelves roughed out, I turned to the drawers, using 1/4-inch ply to knock out all the drawer panels. After cutting the panels to dimension, I made the million cut recesses to all the side panels so the drawer bottom fit snugly into place. Then glued up 3 of our 4 panels. Not pictured is the actual clamp placement. Whoops, but you'll see it as I add a few brad nails to secure everything in place. With the drawer boxes set, I gave each a whitewash, a favorite finishing type of mine because of how utterly sloppy you can be. While that paint dried, I set about pinning the beveled corners of the bench shelves with 3 1/4-inch oak pins for each edge. Kissed the project goodnight, and then the next morning gave all the phase edging a rough sand down before making my first attempt at iron-on edge banding. I'll say this, it's not my favorite edge finish, but I do see why people love it. Very expeditious. With the banding on, I sanded away any roughness or overhang. Then gave the pieces their first oil down. While that first layer dried, I started on the feet. After laminating 2 4/4 pieces together for each foot, I used the table saw to rip them down to roughly 2 by 2 inch feet before taking them to the router for a roundover. With the face corners rounded, I cut them to their final length. Then sanded them down. And gave them their own oilings as well. As those dried, I turned back to the drawer to apply the slider hardware. Easy peasy. Okay, back to the feet. To anchor them to the shelves, I opted for a hanger bolt and threaded insert. Using a simple jig, I placed the hanger bolts in the feet. Unfortunately though, when I went to place the threaded inserts, I chose the wrong Forstner bit and ended up cutting a hole that was just too big. But with a good bit of super glue and activator, I was able to actually get them anchored into place. A classic, not stupid if it works and nobody sees it, right? With those in, the shelves/benches were all but ready to be installed. The last piece would be the half-wall backer that would not only sit behind the shelves but also anchor the Minimalist firewood holder. To create the firewood holder, I simply cut 2 1-inch through mortises into a finished piece of walnut veneered ply at the height I thought would look good for the top of the holder. Then cut 18-inch pieces of 1-inch oak dowels that I also whitewashed to add a little contrast and to draw in other textures from the room. With those pieces prepped, the last bit of prep for the backer was cutting out the hole for the outlet. With that roughed in, I anchored the dowels, then it was time for install. I started by clearing the way. And of course, Haley doesn't do electrical, so shout out to Mr. HWD for helping install the box extensions and replacing the outlets. The second panel only required a small 1/2-inch hole for the coax cable for the cell booster. Then it was time to anchor these panels to the wall. I started at the top, finding studs and simply anchoring the panels to them. Then, for the bottoms, use the mounting of the second half of the beveled wall hangers to anchor the bottom panels as well. With those in place, I could install the framed pieces. Of course, we're still missing drawer fronts. Using 5/4 walnut, I quickly ripped, jointed, planed, and beveled the faces. The bevel would serve as the handle. Then sanded them and gave them a few coats of oil as well. Once dried, it was time to install. I used super glue to mount them before screwing them into place. The last thing to finish off this half wall of built-ins was tidying up the sill. I used 4/4 walnut to mimic the existing sill piece. Then cut a thin trim piece to hide the edging and upper anchor screws. Before finishing both and anchoring them into place. Time to make it feel more like home. And that's a wrap. Until next time.